Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you are. My name's Rob Wilson, and together with Jane Lydon, my colleague from history at University of Western Australia, I'm pleased to welcome you to this third panel in our series, Eugenic Thinking in Australasia, and really looking forward to today. We're really pleased to have Ruth chairing the session. She's the Dean of the College of Indigenous Futures, Education and the Arts, and Director of the Northern Institute at Charles Darwin University. So welcome, Ruth, and keep us under control.
I love a challenge. Thanks so much, Rob, and thank you, Lucia. I'm very pleased that you're here to help us. It's wonderful to see you all here today, and I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. I think it'll be a moment of great learning and sharing. I want to start by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from Larrakia land, beautiful Larrakia land today. And I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and all the lands that we are meeting on today. Those people who walk that earth for a very long time and still do, and lead a lot of the work that we do in our universities, in philosophy, in the work in history, in all of the work that we're engaged with is deeply embedded Indigenous knowledges. And it's very important that we are all engaged with that knowledge and that partnership. I also want to acknowledge that stolen generation of people have been recognised recently. We're really pleased to see some changes here in Darwin, where the Carling compound, the story of what has happened is now being recognised. There's opportunities for compensation. So change is with us, and that's very important. And knowing about what that means for our countries is essential for our work. Today's topic is technologies and disposable people, a very provocative topic. And it got me thinking about, well, what does this mean for us, and who are we, and how could we think about disposable people? And I was really struck by Dylan Alcott's story recently, where he's world #1 in tennis. He won the Golden Slam, that's 4 major titles. He got his Paralympian gold, and all of it was about changing his life and finding new opportunities that he hadn't seen when he had started his life and started his journey. And there was a whole lot of things that changed for him. So how do we think about disposable people, or people with many opportunities, if we think about how we engage with technology and make those opportunities available? We have a fabulous panel who are going to present and provoke us into a bit of conversation today. And we're going to start with Rob Wilson, who I'm sure many people know is the Professor of Philosophy at the University of Western Australia. He's taught all over the world, in Alberta, University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, Queen's University, and more recently at La Trobe in Melbourne. He's the author of, or editor of 7 books that I'm sure are lining all behind you right now. The MIT Encyclopedia of the Cognitive Sciences, and most recently the Eugenic Mind Project. He's established a number of community engagement initiatives with a philosophic edge, including founding Philosophy for Children Alberta in 2008, directing the large-scale research project Living Archives on Eugenics in Western Canada, and most recently founding the not-for-profit Philosophical Engagement in Public Life. His current projects, Keeping Kinship in Mind, funded by the ARC, is keeping him very busy and is getting us engaged in this conversation. Over to you, Rob. Thank you.
All right. Thanks very much, Ruth, for that introduction. I'm just hopefully in the process of sharing my screen. How does that look? Can you see something that looks like a slideshow? All right. So I'll get moving straight up and keep myself to the 15 to 20 minutes that we have. And again, feel free to drop any questions in the Q&A function, and we'll either address them as we go or later on in the discussion when we come back from the breakout rooms. I also wanted to acknowledge that we are learning in Western Australia and the whole of Southwestern Australia on Whadjuk Noongar land, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, land that was never ceded. So there's just 3 things that I want to do today. People have seen me give a talk before. They know there's always 3 things and only 3 things that you can talk about in one given talk. They're not always the same 3 things. So in this one, I'm going to try to say a little bit about the centrality of disability to eugenic thinking and these, what I'm calling technologies of disposability. So that'll sort of set the scene, it'll be a bit of a reminder of the eugenic past and provide a grounding into the eugenic present. Then I want to say something more briefly about the relationships between enhancement and eugenic thinking, and that will certainly have some kind of connection down to what Rob Sparrow has to say just by looking at a flash of his slides a minute ago later in the panel, and I'm looking forward to hearing that. And then I'll finish off by saying something about the recent advocacy of eugenics within Australasian philosophy and bioethics, something that I'm not a disinterested party in, and it might bias my own views of it, but I'll at least have a few things to say about it here. Now, as was seen in the other panels, and as some of you will know from your own backgrounds, race and ethnicity and indigeneity, for that matter, loom very large when we're concerned with eugenic policies that concern things like immigration and child removal practices, both of which constitute forms of cultural eugenics. But it's disability, and especially cognitive and psychiatric disability, that loom larger when we're in the realm of policies that concern segregated institutionalization and sterilization. Those Ruth has just reminded us with the Carlin compound in Darwin. Of course, there was segregated institutionalization for Indigenous people in many parts of Australia, Darwin in particular in that case. And I've really been following those developments with a lot of interest, and I'm glad to hear this latest news with some recognition. And we're working together with some colleagues there at Charles Darwin as well around these sorts of issues. So it's really heartening to hear that. But disability is much more in the foreground in many other sorts of contexts across the world when it comes to eugenic thinking and disposability. And here I want to appeal to Rosemary Garland Thompson's great work from about 10 years ago on conserving disability and this idea of a eugenic logic, a logic of elimination. And it's this idea, and this is a quote from her, that it's not something she's endorsing, just something she's drawing attention to, something she's quite critical of. This idea that our world would be a better place if disability could be eliminated. And the question that's asked is, why should the world we make and occupy together include disability? If we could use technologies to just get rid of disability, wouldn't the place just be much better all round? That's the thought. And that's the thought that Garland Thompson has challenged in her work throughout her whole career. And I think it's a really powerful way to start to both call attention to the status disability often has in connection with, in her case, the notion of elimination, as I'm posing it, disposability, but also as a way to challenge that and move beyond that. Because the way I'm thinking about it here, elimination really is just an extreme form of disposability. So you could dispose of people in the reproductive realm by institutionalizing and sterilizing them. You could dispose of them from family life through child removal practices, or you could dispose of them from the realm of protected rights concerning bodily and personal integrity through human experimentation on them, which certainly happened in Alberta, the case that I'm most familiar with, where you had nearly 3,000 people who were sterilized, and there was much ongoing human experimentation once people had been regarded as being disposable and treated in dehumanized kinds of ways. That was one of the things that truly shocked the court in the Lalani Muir case, when they heard that they were actually removing people's reproductive organs in order to do medical experimentation on them. This is in the 1950s and 1960s. This is well after 1945 and the horrors that were revealed there. And I think it was a turning point in that court case, just as a side note. So it's not, this isn't a fictitious kind of concern or a possible thought experiment. It's something actually that happened to people in Canada, at least, and probably elsewhere. And what I'd like to invoke here is the idea, and it's kind of drawing on the work of David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder, of this idea, where they talk about disabilities being the master trope of human disqualification. I think the same applies to this idea of disposability, of being dispensable, of being optional. You might allow disability to continue, sort of, you have to, but if you've got the technological means to control it and eventually get rid of it, why wouldn't you do that? And here I'd just like to remind people of the, let's put that down, of the recent, relatively recent, now it's nearly 10 years old, Senate inquiry into involuntary or coerced sterilisation of people with disabilities in Australia. And this quite amazing submission that was put in by Women with Disabilities Australia, dehumanised forced sterilisation. It was in response to, they had long-standing concerns about coerced sterilisation of women and girls with disabilities, but when it was revealed in 2011 that there were about 150 or more cases of sterilisation of girls and women with disability revealed through Medicare records, it really lit a fire politically under things, and there was a Senate inquiry they did quite a detailed submission to that linked it to the eugenic past and the ongoing devaluation of the lives of people with disability. So again, this is not very far in the past, and it's just one of the reminders that it's also not far from our own shores, it's actually on them. Okay, so one way in which I want to try and build on this connection between disability and disposability is to go back and invoke this notion of a eugenic trait that I've talked about in the Eugenic Mind project in my book a few years ago. And what I want to do is just give you a quick look at the legislation on sterilisation that ranged over about a 40-year period, and across these 35 jurisdictions, and look at what traits pop out. And if you just do it in a tabular sort of form, so there's 68 statutes or amendments, so roughly 2 per jurisdiction over this 40-year period. And you can see the traits that come up most frequently are traits that concern intellectual, cognitive, psychiatric, mental disability, feeble-mindedness, insanity, imbecility, idiocy. They're right up there amongst them, and epilepsy as well, which is an interesting kind of trait in many sorts of ways. I won't get too distracted by it right now, but often it would be thought to have a mental or cognitive dimension to it as well. So apart from criminality, really all of the other top rating sorts of traits here in the legislations that provide grounds for sterilisation are all traits that have to do with cognitive or mental disabilities. Another way to get at this sort of connection, centrality of disability to eugenics past and disposability is by, again, a bit of a reminder for some of you about the model sterilisation law that was articulated by Harry Lachlan in 1922. This was a law that was aimed to kind of speed up the rates of sterilisation in the United States, the idea being that there were lots of constitutional challenges to the sterilisation of people, and he wanted to sort of standardize what the laws looked like in lots of jurisdictions. And what the Act sort of said, the central notion here was this idea of a socially inadequate person. And there's a definition of a given right in the middle here. It's one who, by his or her own effort, regardless of etiology or prognosis, fails chronically in comparison with normal persons to maintain himself or herself as a useful member of the organised social life of the state. And then he appealed to this idea of a socially inadequate class, and that the socially inadequate classes were, as you might expect, dominated by the very same sorts of traits that you find in eugenic sterilisation laws already and after this 1922 attempt to standardise sterilisation legislation. So the feeble-minded and the insane. So again, intellectual, cognitive, psychiatric disabilities are flagged here with slightly different language than we'd use now. But also, as the list goes on, you'll see, again, criminals pop up, epileptics, inebriates, the diseased, the blind, the deaf, the deformed, and the dependent. So these were the categories that he tried to have all states conform with as picking out people who were socially inadequate and if they had any of these traits, that would be the grounds for sterilising them and kind of disposing of them from future generations. So I'm just partly calling attention to 2 sorts of things here. One is just the dominance of traits that are associated with disability in this sort of list, sometimes very explicitly, sometimes implicitly. And secondly, just this idea, linking this idea of social inadequacy with the idea of disposability when it comes to future generations and whom we see as a fully fledged member of our society in the future. And sterilization, of course, is one of the founding technologies of eugenics. The social policies that appeal to it, as well as other sorts of social policies, are themselves, in my view, technologies as well. But we'll hear more about, if you like, more standard sorts of technologies or more recent and ongoing and developing technologies probably in the other talks. So let me now move to the second half of the talk to say a little bit about the relationship between enhancement and eugenic thinking, and also the recent advocacy of eugenics within Australasian philosophy and bioethics. So some of you will have seen this story. This was in the Atlantic about just under a year ago, The Last Children of Down Syndrome, and it's about the so-called Danish elimination of Down syndrome through prenatal screening. And there's this conception that technologies such as reproductive technologies provide a way to fix, repair, replace, or restore. Often when those technologies are employed intrapersonally, they're thought of as forms of enhancement. When they're applied intergenerationally, they're certainly a form of eugenics, because you're trying to change the composition of the population so that certain sorts of people are more dominantly represented in the next generation, and other sorts of people are represented much less in future generations, and eventually eliminated, but sort of disposed of along the way. And so the highlight in the Down syndrome sort of case just typifies that. And there was a lot of attention given to this between 2017 and 2020 in the popular sort of press, and more extended sorts of coverage in places like the Atlantic. But that's at the beginning of life, if you like, and how we stop future generations. But also more recently, you can see the same kind of attitudes towards the disposability of people who have lived experience with disability in the Canadian made legislation. It's basically euthanasia legislation, but it's not called that, medical assistance in dying, that passed in March 2021, where what's striking about the legislation, whatever you think about euthanasia in general, is that in this legislation and very little other legislation, do you have disability as being the only grounds for the voluntary termination of your own life when death isn't reasonably foreseeable. And that comes out because one of the conditions is that you need to have a grievous and irremediable condition in order for the application to be successful. And that's spelled out, first of all, in this condition here, that you have a serious illness, disease, or disability. And for now, that excludes mental illness, but in 2023, it will include mental illness as well. And that had started off when this legislation first came out. It was one of the definite exclusions, because the idea that people could give full consent when they have a psychiatric condition that might make them undervalue their life in a systematic sort of way seemed to rule that out. But more generally, now this is one of the few pieces of legislation that sort of more actively encourages people experiencing disability to be singled out and to sort of seek euthanasia as a kind of resolution of their issues or problems. And this was opposed by over 100 disability advocacy organizations in Canada, but was still pushed through in actually strengthened form than when it started. It was quite striking. So I think this idea of disposability now extends to allowing free choice to end your life, if you like, early, but only if you have disabling sorts of conditions. That's one of the necessary conditions. You can't do it just because you're poor or just because you're having a hard time, but you don't have a medically diagnosed condition. You can otherwise. That I found quite a striking reminder of how central this link is between disposability and disability in contemporary thinking. So finally, I just want to briefly touch on this, what's going on in the current Australasian philosophy and bioethics scene. And some of you will know there are a range of places in which eugenics has been defended. So all I've got here is just screenshots from a series of articles that appear in Monash Bioethics Review. The first on the left on my left of the screen is Defending Eugenics by Jonathan Anomaly. that at that time when I took that screenshot had 19,000 accesses. It now has over 22,000. Relative to other articles that are in the review, it's probably an order of magnitude at least higher than others. And you might wonder why, what's going on there. I wrote a response to it that was published the year after called Eugenics Undefended. And now there's been another response by Anomaly and 5 other authors, including, tellingly in my view, Peter Singer, which challenges the Eugenics Undefended sort of attack on defending eugenics. So there's now a whole series of papers on this. And I'm just going to say something, briefly about that in finishing up, and why I'm concerned about some of it, apart from that, having a dog in this fight. I want to try and step back from that a little bit as much as I can and make some more general comments about it. So this is going on in what I consider to be my workspace, the philosophical workspace. And for years, because my focus has been working with people with lived experience of disability, some of whom had been institutionalized, sterilized, and had this lived experience of this history of living with eugenics. And because I'm not really trained in bioethics, when I look at what's happening in bioethics and the attitudes that people have towards things like sterilization or the use of so-called enhancement technologies to modify populations, I'm sort of thinking, hang on, are we in the same world here? Because it feels very sort of different. And so I approach this not as a bioethicist, but as a philosopher of science with an investment in thinking about community engagement around disability. And so, it's a bit of an outsider on this, same as I approach the stuff on euthanasia as well, I think is informed in that way. And that's how I approach the Senate inquiry in Canada. But what's actually going on in this? Sorry, is this, there we go, that's better. So here's just near the beginning of Anomaly's paper, just to give you a feel for it. In defending eugenics, I want to reclaim the spirit of authors like Francis Galton and Charles Darwin, who believe that our reproductive obligations change with our understanding of biology and our capacity to control it. Defending eugenics does not commit us to endorsing state-sponsored coercion, nor the parochial views held by some advocates of eugenics in the early 20th century, and likewise. So it makes it sound it's locating the view, making it sound very sort of reasonable with a certain kind of distance from past eugenics, but not so much that you wouldn't use the term eugenics to describe the view, interestingly. You think that if you really want to create some distance from that, you might not use the term eugenics, but that's not how it has panned out. And then the basic sort of take that I had on this, just to give you the thumbnail, is there were 7 grounds of criticism, from the failure to argue for eugenics to the mischaracterization of both eugenics and the scientific consensus, misleading simplifications of history, carelessness about race, IQ, Ashkenazi Jews, idiosyncratic appeal to Buck versus Bell, the famous US case, and a lack of substance in linking demography, eugenics, and policy. So there was that's a sort of, you might think that's a standard sort of academic bit of back and forth. What you get in the new paper by Veit, Anomaly, Agar, Singer, Fleischman, and Minerva, it starts off like this, when they point out that there's this debate going on between Anomaly and me. They're concerned with this higher level question of whether eugenics, something called eugenics, can be defended at all, and saying basically, there's a lot of confusion in this debate, and really it seems like a lot of people are worried about what we call it, and we want to get onto the substance of the issues. Right? What we want to do is we want to get onto this more philosophically important question of how we should view these technologies from the perspective of ethics and policy. Again, sounds very, very reasonable, very sort of balanced, but clearly in this kind of eugenic space. And where they go, sort of, where they conclude in the paper is here. They say, just as enhancement isn't a unified category that we can simply judge as morally good or bad, so too with genetic enhancement or eugenics. And sometimes in the paper, they just use those terms interchangeably. And they go on, if our goal is to find the best answers to complex questions and so on, it won't do to operate in echo chambers of our respective academic niches. Have to stop thinking in purely partisan terms, where anyone who doesn't agree with our conclusions is ridiculed and publicly condemned. But how can we fight this polarization? So here they're locating it partly as an issue of academic freedom. And just to sort of finish up, I just want to draw the connection to the other sort of work that's going on, Anomaly and some other authors here defending racial differences in IQ testing, saying basically most scholars aren't courageous enough to really take this up, and we're going to do that. This is in the journal Personality Individual Differences. And again, I just highlight this sort of quickly. I can drop these into the Slack channel, the papers themselves. They kind of use this term liberal creationism or selective dualism as a label for the views that won't acknowledge that there's a genetic component, an important genetic component to psychological traits. It's treating the mind in a different way than everything else. And that's a view that in an anonymous, pseudonymous paper, I should say, published in the Journal of Controversial Ideas, which some of you may have heard of, that Peter Singer was involved in launching. This is a view they call cognitive creationism, where they run a parallel, whoever this author is, between young Earth creationism as a kind of fundamentally unscientific sort of view, and cognitive creationism, which is basically liberal creationism, as also putatively unscientific view. So what they're trying to do is locate this in a debate about academic freedom and about certain sorts of controversial views as not being given airtime. And I see something much more nefarious going on here, not deliberately and not, though sometimes you wonder, but in a way that really shifts what's acceptable sorts of conversation. And all I ask you to think about in closing here is, think about if people were advocating these views with respect to sex or gender, or with respect to racial variation, more explicitly, though it's right there in the Dodging Darwin paper. Is that stuff that would get airplay, and it's just something that we have to kind of wonder about? Or are these views about sort of people as being inherently sort of inferior and disposable, ones that we would accept in those cases? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rob. That was a very powerful presentation to get us started and to show just how close and urgent this conversation is. I really appreciate it. You have got a question, but I think we've run out of time. Could we move that into the final section? Because it's, can everyone please join me in thanking Rob. Next, it's an absolute pleasure to invite Jane Carey to the conversation to take us to the next step. She teaches and researches across settler colonial women's and Indigenous histories at the University of Wollongong, where she's a founding co-director of the Centre for Colonial and Settler Studies. Her research focuses in the intersections between histories of racial science, whiteness, gender, and settler colonialism. She's written extensively on the adoption and promotion of eugenics by the Australian women's movement in the early 20th century, and the Racial Hygiene Association of New South Wales, which is now the Family Planning Association. The Eugenic Foundation's Marie Stopes and Margaret Sanger's campaign for birth control into the interwar years as well. More broadly, her work has demonstrated how race sciences like eugenics both shaped settler colonial governance and inspired a myriad of social movements, including the women's and Indigenous movements. She's the co-editor of 5 collections, including Reorienting Whiteness, Creating White Australia, Indigenous Networks, Mobility, Connections and Exchange, and Colonial Formations. And we're looking forward to your next monograph, Talking to the Field, A History of Australian Women and Science. Welcome, Jane, and thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much, Ruth. I should have shortened that bio. I wrote it very quickly. But yes, firstly, I'd like to also begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, whose sovereignty has never been ceded. I'm speaking from their lands today. And this is particularly profound given some of the topics we're discussing, and always to keep in mind the importance, as Ruth indicated at the outset, of the Indigenous knowledges that in the country that we're based in at the moment. Okay, so I'll just share my screen. Hopefully this will work. Right, okay. So my talk today, as the historian on the panel, unsurprisingly, my talk's primarily going to focus on the history of eugenics, specifically in Australia, as well as the extent to which the legacies of this history are being acknowledged, understood and confronted in the present, or the lack of acknowledgement actually that's taking place. So a lot of what I'm going to discuss will follow very much on from what Rob has been discussing, but more specifically in the Australian context. So in the interest of front-loading my talk, I want to give the conclusion at the outset in case I run out of time. So the key point that I'm wanting to try and convey in my talk today is that while internationally there have been some significant moves towards confronting the history of eugenics and its ongoing legacies, this is yet to be really seen in Australia. So there are two things I want to do in the talk today. One is convey the extent to which Australia's eugenic past still remains relatively under-researched and little known, and even less well understood in some ways, and how this in turn is linked to the lack of recognition of the legacies of eugenics in the present. So in other words, the capacity to confront the contemporary legacies of Australian eugenics is severely constrained by this lack of historical awareness. So I'm going to have some PowerPoint slides which will often just actually not directly or completely coincide with what I'm speaking about. I'm hoping just to give you a bit of a flavour of the history of Australian eugenics through some of these slides. So as I was saying, the full reach and diversity of Australian eugenics remains under-recognised in historical scholarship. So most historical histories of eugenics have naturally focused on Germany, the site of the worst atrocity, but also on the US and other countries where eugenic sterilisation laws and a range of other measures eugenic measures were enacted into law. The UK has also been a key focus, given, of course, the prominent place of Francis Galton as, in many ways, the founder of eugenic science, and he coined the term eugenics in 1883. So just to remind us all that, as Galton defined it, eugenics was concerned with, quote, all the influences that improve the inborn qualities of a race and also those that develop them to the utmost advantage. And I want to particularly highlight Galton's use of the term there, a race. So the ways in which eugenic discourse and eugenic technologies were emerged in particular places were always racially specific. And this includes when they were directed at members of the white race as much as any other people. So in the early 20th century, eugenics enjoyed wide support across both conservatives and progressive reformers across much of the globe. So organised eugenics movements emerged not just in Germany and Britain and the United States in the early 1900s, but they spread to many other European countries, Canada, Central and South America, Japan, India, as well as Australasia. So while eugenics is, of course, the most tragically associated with the Holocaust and with programs for immigration restriction, segregation, sterilisation, biological absorption, and so on, I also want to situate it in terms of other much more, I guess, you might call mundane strategies or technologies for creating competitive racial advantage. So these kinds of measures included all sorts of things, from requirements for premarital health certificates to school medical services, kindergartens, programs for public and particularly maternal health and infant health, a whole range of parks and playgrounds. You could go on and on. The range of these kind of technologies, to use the kind of terms we're using here, was really quite vast. So internationally, then, scholars have been emphasising the broad appeal that eugenics enjoyed in the early 20th century, but also its ordinariness and its adaptability. So eugenics was not the same in all of the different countries where it was taken up. So there's no singular eugenic agenda. Eugenics was adapted within particular local contexts, and perhaps most noticeably, we might think in Latin America, Latin American eugenics, there was a lot of emphasis on the eugenic value of interracial breeding, for example. So it's this kind of broader context of the diversity, broad reach, and in some ways mundane nature of eugenics in the early 20th century that I want to situate my more specific discussion of Australian eugenics now. So Australian historians have certainly addressed some aspects of eugenics, but at the same time, I want to suggest that the broader historical impact of eugenics in Australia has been minimised, in part simply based on the fact that, aside from some short-lived Tasmanian legislation in the 1920s and a few other minor examples, there were no significant eugenic laws ever passed in Australia. this interpretation, of course, ignores the ways in which the White Australia policy, the Immigration Restriction Act, was in fact clearly linked to eugenic thinking. So what this perspective elides, however, the idea that Australia was not particularly impacted by eugenics, by eugenic thinking. So it elides the ways, the enormous impact that eugenic thinking actually had across a wide range of policies, institutions, and especially in its broader social and cultural impact. So the focus of much Australian policy, as with research elsewhere, has been on state policies, which in the Australian case largely failed to be enacted, on doctors, scientists and public servants who conducted eugenic research or advocated eugenic measures. And much of this work has also been sort of located within subfields of history of science and medicine. And so perhaps its impact on more mainstream Australian history, if you like, has been limited. So even, as I said, some of the clear links between eugenics and the White Australia policy have largely failed to be noted or failed to be emphasised within broader scholarship. And there's been particularly a failure to perhaps document the broad reach and appeal of eugenics. And this is, particularly the case, I'll just go back to that one, particularly the case for what it seems more progressive or left-wing movements at this time. There's been a real reluctance amongst Australian scholars, I think, to confront the ways in which those they deem progressive actually also adopted and promoted eugenic thinking. And this is very much the focus of my work on the Australian women's movement. Finally, I won't get to speak too much about this today, but there's also been a kind of a sidelining of the ways in which Australian policies of biological assimilation in relation to Indigenous peoples has not been seen as connected to eugenics. In fact, many scholars have argued that it was antithetical to the eugenic movement, which is assumed to be based on ideas about purity of race, and thus these sorts of biological programs were not seen to be compatible with eugenic thinking. So as I said, doctors and scientists and other academics are certainly key figures of the Australian eugenics movement and have received some attention. But there were certainly many more adherents and promoters of eugenics in wider social reform movements up to the 1930s. And my own work, as I said, in particular is focused on how the Australian women's movement supported and promoted eugenic ideas and reforms, both in general, but more specifically also in relation to birth control campaigns. So another part of my work, again, I won't have time to look at this very much, is particularly about how some Maori activists also engaged with eugenic thinking. So much of my research has focused on the Racial Hygiene Association of New South Wales, which became the present day Family Planning Association of New South Wales. Now, the reason I focus on this movement is because it's the largest and longest lasting of the Australian eugenics organisations. I argue that, in fact, the founding of the Racial Hygiene Association in 1926 really represents the start of a major organised eugenics movement in Australia. So it was formed in Sydney, as in 1926, at a meeting organised by the Women's League, and the overwhelming majority of its members were women. So it was led at first by its enigmatic co-president, Ruby Rich, and Secretary Lily Goodison, as well as the prominent eugenicist and sex education campaigner, Marion Puddington. So this is very much a women's organisation. The organisation's three objectives were to campaign for sex education, the prevention and eradication of venereal disease, and, quote, the education of the community on eugenic principles. And in 1933, they opened Australia's first birth control clinic, and this is the activity for which they're largely remembered. So while some scholars have downplayed the extent of the association's eugenic interests, emphasising instead its support for birth control as a feminist project, my argument is that these birth control and feminist arguments actually were completely intertwined. And the aim of promoting eugenic reforms actually animated all of the association's endeavours, once you can understand that eugenics and feminism are entirely compatible in this period. So this is a pamphlet from the Racial Hygiene Association from the mid-1930s, and particularly is advertising the services of its Marriage Advisory Centre, which offered premarital health checks. So this is, absolutely a eugenic kind of technology. The idea that people should have a thorough health check before they got married, and if any defects were found, they should not be allowed to get married. They should not be allowed to breed or proceed with the marriage. So this, in various reports, the Marriage Advisory Centre is specifically listed under the eugenic work of the association, and the various advertising, it included both physical testing and significantly mental testing as well. So the doctor who largely ran the clinic was Dr. Shallett, who was Ruby Rich's husband, and he's very much associated with this component of the association's work. So we have all of this. Sorry, there's more. The idea that preparation for marriage means safety. So the couple about to walk off a cliff, they need a health check before they get married to avoid that. The other thing I want to emphasise is the ways that all of this work was clearly directed specifically at white Australia. So this is made clear in this advertising, a campaign that was launched by the association, a fundraising campaign in 1927, which argued that their work was going to produce a real white Australia. And that meant a white Australia which didn't have the problem of the unfit, the burden of the unfit and their breeding. So achieving this ideal white Australia was going to require radical interventions, especially in combating the racial threat posed by mental defectives. And so this is, a really prominent part of their campaign, and was a focus of a three-day congress organised by the association in 1929 on racial hygiene. And many of the sessions there were devoted to discussions of the feeble-minded. The final session was devoted to eugenics and sterilisation, after which they passed 7 pro-sterilisation resolutions. And as Lily Goodison observed in her closing comments, we all expected much hot discussion on this debatable subject, but not so. So the whole association and participants were all in agreement that this was a necessary measure for ensuring the safety of white Australia. And congratulating the participants, she concluded, "I know we are going to do great things to help build up a healthy, virile race in Australia." So I might just skip the next bit. The Racial Hygiene Association of Australia was caught up with, was intersected with broader international birth control movements at this time, all of which had strong links to eugenics, particularly through the work of both Margaret Sanger in the US and Murray Stopes in the UK. And that's something that I've done quite a bit of research on. I'll just skip through that, and I'll go to my second Australian example. Here I want to talk just briefly about an individual, Lorna Hodgkinson, who was really a key figure in New South Wales in terms of introducing special institutions for mentally defective children. So Hodgkinson, born 1887, she begins as a teacher, and then in sort of around World War I, so she starts to pioneer classes for mental defectives just before World War I, and just after World War I, she's given paid leave to go to the US to study the treatment of mental defectives, with a view to her coming back and using her knowledge to implement programs in the New South Wales Education Department. So a doctoral thesis at Harvard used a state program for the diagnosis and treatment of atypical children. And she returns to New South Wales in 1922 to take up a post specifically created for her which is the superintendent or later supervisor of the education of mental defectives. And she plays, she gives very prominent evidence in the New South Wales Royal Commission on Lunacy Law in 23, where she's very critical of the department's lack of provision for mentally defective children. She's then enshrouded in a controversy. She gets dismissed from her position and she opens a private institution instead called the Sunshine Institute. And that's a residential school. I'll return to that later. So it has an ongoing presence today, although not as an institution. So I'll come back to that towards the end of the talk. So here's just to give a bit of flavour of some of the ways in which Hodgkinson argued for the importance of her work. As we can see, the terms feeble-minded, the US influence that Rob has just been talking about, all of those kinds of things, very evident in the ways in which she talks about this. Here's some of her evidence from the 1923 Royal Commission. The uncontrolled reproduction of the lowest types of humanity must result in the physical deterioration of the race. So these kinds of statements were, within the context of the time, not extraordinary. I guess what I'm trying to, we can understand the extent and impact of eugenic thinking once we understand the extent to which statements like this were seen as uncontroversial, not extreme. They were, in the context of their times, seen as, in the spectrum of normal kinds of ways of thinking about these issues. So, again, the kind of really emotive language, unless steps are taken to ensure the perpetuation of a healthy and normal population before it's too late, we will be inviting inevitable shipwreck as a people. So just some of the things there. Also, just to bring it back to the Racial Hygiene Association conference, she also delivered an address at that conference in 1929 on mental deficiency as a problem of racial hygiene. So these are just some small snippets of this really strong history of Australian engagements with the eugenics movement, ones which are still yet to really be, I think, fully appreciated. So I just want to turn now about to really just finish up with the ways in which these histories have not actually been acknowledged in terms of their contemporary legacies. So, oops, sorry. So this is Unison, which is the organisation that formed out of Lorna Hodgkinson's Sunshine Institute. And the history section on the website for the organisation begins with talking about Hodgkinson as a remarkable Australian of dedication and vision who establishes the Sunshine Institute. It talks about her as a passionate campaigner who campaigned for the rights of people with intellectual disabilities. And there is no sense, none whatsoever, in this institutional's history that's currently on their website, any understanding of the eugenic context in which Hodgkinson's eugenic beliefs or the context in which the institutions were founded. Similarly with the Family Planning Association, the Racial Hygiene, there's no mention of the Racial Hygiene Association on its website, just the fact that it was founded in 1926. There's been a range of other very prominent acknowledgements of the eugenic past by a number of overseas institutions, particularly in relation to Planned Parenthood and Margaret Sanger's involvement. I'll just quickly flick through this. Murray Stopes International's also changed its name. But though the Australian branch of the Murray Stopes Australia has not changed its name, there's been, for example, a very prominent inquiry into the history of eugenics at UCL, which resulted in a public apology earlier this year. We haven't seen anything like that occurring in Australia. So I'd just like to finish there. I think Ruth is telling me it's time. So thanks very much. I look forward to some questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jane. You've made it so real, and so the language of normalisation and how deep that is in the Australian psyche and culture. Thank you very much. I know everyone is cheering and applauding right now. There's a lot of good debate that was going on through that your presentation that we'll take into the next discussion. But I think it's really important that we now bring in Professor Rob Sparrow to bring in the idea of technology and how that links. So thank you very much, Jane. Rob is a professor in the philosophy program and a chief investigator in the ARC Council Centre of Excellence for Electromaterial Science at Monash University. You can hear that's very far from my world, where he works on ethical issues raised by new technologies. He's completed an ARC Future Fellowship on a new ethics for the development and application of genetic technologies in a pluralistic society. He's been a Japanese Society for the Promotion of Science visiting fellow at Kyoto University, a visiting fellow at the CUHK Centre for Bioethics at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, a visiting fellow at Carnegie Mellon, and a visiting fellow at the Centre for Biomedical Ethics at the National University of Singapore. He's published widely on the ethics of human enhancement and the new eugenics, and will take us to the next stage of this discussion. Thank you very much, Rob.
Thanks, Ruth. And I like to think that my talk is going to follow nicely from the two previous presentations, because in part what I'm going to try to do here is to link and situate Rob's concerns about the sort of present and future of Australian bioethics and bioethics internationally to the history of eugenic practices about which we've just heard. I would like to acknowledge that I am speaking from the lands of the people of the Kulin Nations, and that the history of the theft of Indigenous lands and the historical and continuing mistreatment of Indigenous peoples around the world should absolutely frame and inform our discussions of the future uses of genetic technologies with which I'm concerned here today. When ordinary people hear talk of designer babies or human enhancement or producing supermen, I think it's fair to say that people's minds naturally turn to the history of those concepts in fascist thought and in the kind of futurist thought of the 1920s through to the 1940s. It'll come as some surprise then, I think, to many people that my profession, philosophy and bioethics, routinely speaks about designer babies and about becoming superhuman and about human enhancement as something that is obviously and straightforwardly good. And that, as Rob has shown, my profession now very much tries to place the burden of proof on people who think that there's any reason to be concerned about the project of shaping future people using all of the technologies now available to us. I guess in this talk, what I want to try to do is suggest that the philosophical debate about human enhancement is taking place at a rarefied level, which fails to connect its present and its future to the history that people should be paying attention to. I guess I might at this stage just point out that the contemporary thinking about genetic technologies to shape future generations is informed by a distinction between what people call the old and the new eugenics. And I'll just bring up a slide to see if I can make that go backwards. A distinction between the old and the new eugenics, because my colleagues who are enthusiastic about the use of genetic technologies to police who comes into existence aren't Nazis. They're not unaware of the history of eugenic thought, but they think that it's something that we can escape by embracing a new eugenics that can be appropriately distanced from the history of the old eugenics. And so people will typically make a number of distinctions along the lines indicated in this slide, where the old eugenics had a perfectionist vision of what the future looked like, you know, Aryan man. The new eugenics is pluralistic and leaves it up to parents to decide what kind of children they want to have. Where the old eugenics had bad science, the new eugenics has good science. And I think that's one place where people really need to push on this distinction, because as one of those slides that Rob puts up suggests, the science of today and the science of the past are not that distant from each other, not as distant from each other as people might like to think. The old eugenics was concerned with populations and population level traits, notoriously the health of the race, whereas the new eugenics is supposedly concerned only with the welfare of future individuals. And obviously the old eugenics was murderous and human rights violating, whereas the new eugenics is supposed to be founded on respect for reproductive liberty. I should also say, I really feel the attraction of the new eugenics. I think that discussions of eugenic thought today are unlikely to engage properly with other people in the debate unless they acknowledge the attraction of the idea of having healthy babies. Now, we should absolutely call into question what counts to be healthy and who gets to make those decisions. But it does seem to me that the idea that women have a right to control their own bodies, including to decide which reproductive technologies to access, and that parents are often concerned to ensure that their child has opportunities to have a good life. Those thoughts aren't going to go away because we emphasise the history of eugenic thought. So for me, understanding the relationship between old and new eugenics is a central task. The history is clearly important, but we also have to engage with these arguments on their own terms. But one of the ways I think we do need to engage with those arguments is by paying attention to their politics and not just to their ethics. And that shift from ethics to politics, I think, means that a lot of what people are saying in the debate about the ethics of the new eugenics is going to be revealed as profoundly naive. And also that people are deluding themselves if the political circumstances that led to the old eugenics couldn't re-emerge, or indeed those tendencies aren't here today. So part of what I think is important to be thinking about at this particular historical moment is about the role of philosophers in a public culture, and the responsibility of intellectuals to be concerned not just with the question of whether or not they're making good arguments, but with the way in which those arguments are likely to be received in an imperfect world. The technologies that people are considering in the contemporary philosophical debate about the so-called new eugenics are at least twofold. People used to talk mostly about pre-implantation genetic diagnosis and the selection of children who might have so-called above species typical capabilities. Now the debate is moving very quickly to the potential of genome editing systems such as CRISPR-Cas9 to directly modify human embryos in order to give them traits that might make them better than well. Interestingly, the ethics of those two technologies looks quite different insofar as where a failure to select an embryo may not harm or benefit anyone, a failure to modify an embryo might be conceptualized as being a harm. So if there is an obligation, as some of my colleagues suggest, to use these technologies, it's going to be a very strong obligation when it comes to the CRISPR-Cas9 system. Having said that, those technologies are the things that people are talking about, it's also important to recognise that this stuff is mostly still science fiction. You'd be a very brave parent indeed who tried to genetically modify their child to enhance them in the current environment. Pre-implantation diagnosis is not very useful for selecting in traits, almost always involves selecting out traits. And that fact that we can't actually do any of this stuff, that when it comes to human enhancement, our genetic technologies are no good, I think it's really important here because it says something about what's driving the debate, which is there's not an urgent philosophical necessity or there's not an urgent practical need to work out how we're going to use these technologies when it comes to human enhancement. Rather, this is driven by other academic and intellectual imperatives. And then if there are high political costs of engaging in these debates, perhaps we should take those more seriously. So philosophers today are not just arguing that we should police who comes into existence, that parents should be given the option of, for instance, terminating pregnancies where there is a diagnosis of a serious disorder. They're actually arguing that parents should either be permitted or perhaps are morally obligated to use these technologies to try to have what's called the best child possible. I count Julian Savulescu, he's both been a colleague of mine and I count him as a friend. I obviously don't endorse everything that he says when it comes to this debate, but this paper, Procreative Beneficence, Why We Should Select the Best Children, is one of the most cited papers in applied ethics. It's absolutely driving the literature on human enhancement using genetic technologies at the moment. This other paper that on this slide is less well known, Why Genetic Testing for Genes for Criminality is Morally Required. That came out in the Princeton Journal of Bioethics in the year 2000. And I think it's worth highlighting that Julian is Professor of Practical Ethics at Oxford University. He's had appointments at Monash as well. And the Princeton of Journal, obviously Princeton's a very prestigious institution as well. So these clearly eugenic, in some sense, ideas are being aired today at the heart of the modern international university system. These aren't fringe views in philosophy. This is absolutely the kind of mainstream of bioethical thought nowadays. Is asking what could possibly be wrong with eugenics. I think that people, and I have spent a lot of my time engaging with these arguments, both in terms of their politics, but also in terms of their own internal logic. And it is really striking that philosophers think that they can make these arguments about a moral obligation to choose the best child possible without ending up with the conclusion that the state should be mandating the use of reproductive technologies, that actually it should be a form of, and this phrase gets bandied about occasionally, a form of genetic child abuse to permit children to be born with genetic conditions that could have been diagnosed earlier in the pregnancy and some other child being brought into existence instead. So people working in this field are either often making making one of two arguments. Some of my colleagues are arguing that in fact parents are obligated to have the best child possible. Others merely argue that it's morally permissible for prospective parents to access new genetic technologies to try to enhance their children in various ways. I'm concerned with both the means and the ends of human enhancement, and the ends or the goals that one would be aiming at if one were really serious about choosing the best child possible look much more like the goals of the old eugenics than people think. So if you took seriously the idea that parents were obligated to have the best child possible, it seems to me, for instance, that we should all have the same cloned child. Best is a maximizing notion. The idea of the best child possible relative to some particular environment, because of course the child's life prospects are always going to be the result of interaction between genetics and environment. But if there is a best child possible and parents are obligated to have that best child, there's nothing here that says that they should have a child that's genetically related to them. We should all be accessing the same cloned embryo with the best human genome and choosing to have that child. Because of gene-environment interactions, it also a concern for maximizing the opportunities available to your child or their expected welfare also suggests that you should take into account features of the environment like sexism and racism, which means that in a sexist world, the best child possible might well be a male child, and a racist child, it might well be a white child. Now, obviously, of course, this is selection against normal human traits, and some people think that's, particularly medical profession thinks you shouldn't be selecting within the normal, but advocates of human enhancement don't think the normal matters. They don't think it's morally significant at all. So it's very hard to resist within the logic of this argument, the idea that everybody should be having these white, male, handsome babies, which is to say that the vision of the new eugenics and the vision of the old eugenics end up coalescing in a very particular notion of what it is to have the best possible life. And we can see here how arguments of implicit assumptions about privilege and about the significance of social injustice are playing a key role in driving these arguments towards that conclusion. So that's the end. The end to which this argument tends, a very particular notion of what counts as a good future child. What about the means? Well, there's something here, and this is a sort of philosophical complexity that's quite hard to explain quickly, but when people are thinking about the choice of which child to bring into existence, if these are choices that affect the identity of the child, they are not what Derek Parfit called person affecting, which is to say the person who is brought into existence will struggle to express the idea that the claim that they might be harmed or benefited by the choice that brought them into existence. Because had someone done something else, a different child would have been born. So had my parents chosen to terminate the pregnancy that became me and had a girl instead, I'm not going to be able to complain that they didn't do that. If my mother could have married a wealthier man, I'm not going to be able to complain that she didn't, because had those things happened, I wouldn't have existed at all. Now, this philosophical subtlety enables people to simultaneously argue that we are morally obligated to have the best child possible, and we don't harm anyone if we don't do it. Which is to say that this tradition, that this line of argumentation tries to combine a strong consequentialist argument about the nature of our obligations with a libertarian perspective that people do nothing wrong if they don't act on the obligation that Julian and others have identified. Now that might work, that's all very well in theory to say, look, if people might have an obligation, but if they fail to act on it, they don't do anything wrong. And as a result of that, the state shouldn't enforce this obligation. But actually the idea that the state should be not concerned with the question of the health of future populations is actually very hard to defend. Even the so-called disability critique of the use of genetic technologies often participates in eugenic thinking insofar as it's concerned with the character of future populations. So, for instance, Rosemary Garland-Thompson's argument that we should conserve disability is an argument about the distribution of genes at the level of the population. There doesn't seem to be an alternative when it comes to regulating genetic technologies than thinking about population level distribution of traits. And this becomes very obvious when it comes to sex selection, for instance, where people in arguments about sex selection refer to sex ratios, future sex ratios, the consequences of sex selection. So the idea that the state isn't going to pay attention to the implications for public health or the availability of these technologies just seems to me utopian. That in actual fact, once these technologies are widely available, they'll be regulated one way or another. And if people make this argument about an obligation to have the best child possible, they're encouraging the state to take up those tools and indeed regulate towards that end. Now, that may not happen necessarily, but now let me conclude by pointing out the politics, the real world politics of advocating human enhancement along these lines is shaped by the cultural reception and the history of these ideas. So let me just show you a couple of book covers and I'll conclude with these images. This is Julian Savulescu and Nick Bostrom, another famous advocate of human enhancement. This is their edited collection on human enhancement. This is John Harris's book, Enhancing Evolution, The Ethical Case for Making Better People, very renowned bioethicist at the University of Manchester, leading figure for many years in debates about the so-called new eugenics. Look at the politics of that image. And then here's someone I shared an office with and I also count as a friend, Nick Agar's book, Liberal Eugenics. I haven't spoken much about liberal eugenics today for reasons of time, but again, straight out of fascist iconography. Now, I don't think all of these people got to choose their book covers. I think these book covers were chosen for them by their editors and their graphic designers. But the fact that those images are on those books tells us something about what people are looking to hear, and indeed what people do hear when they encounter these arguments about human enhancement. Whether philosophers like it or not, once these arguments leave the seminar room into the public debate, all their concerns about reproductive liberty, their concerns about good science versus bad science risk going out the window. And like it or not, it seems to me, when people engage in these debates about the so-called new eugenics, they need to be aware that the political line between us and the old eugenics is much thinner than they think. People think because they're hanging around the university that we live in a liberal society, but the social democratic institutions that enabled people to resist fascism in the past have been whittled away by the last 30 years of resurgent capitalism. So I think there's a real danger here that whether we like it or not, the history will re-emerge. Now, there's a complex set of intellectual issues here about the obligations of intellectuals in an unjust society that we need to think about and we will consider when we move to discussion and questions. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Rob. And please, everyone, join me in thanking Rob for a fantastic talk and to bring that link between the individual, the institution and that moral pressure, and then what it means for our own institutions where we work is very powerful. I want to thank you very much. And clearly there's a lot more to talk about, which we'll pick up in the discussion part of the next section of this presentation.